UFC 311 full card predictions. This is updated as of the 17th, so all of the drama with the main event has been sorted out, and my predictions will match that. Starting off with the first fight of the early prelims, we've got Tagir Ulabenkov versus Clayton Carpenter. Now, originally, I was going to pick Ulabenkov because he's a pretty sizable favorite. He's Dagestani. He's got Habib in his corner. He comes from that whole camp. However, I think Carpenter is a pretty good opponent, and I think Ulabenkov has some holes in his game that Clayton Carpenter can exploit. Ulabenkov has lost to Tim Elliott, who's a grappler. He had a close fight with Alan Nascimento, who found success off the bottom with sweeps in their fight. And also, most recently, he lost to Jesse Formiga in ADXC, who no longer in the UFC. Clayton Carpenter, being a pretty competent grappler and being younger and probably improving more fight to fight, I think might find his back in some of the exchanges. And even if he doesn't find his back, if he uses his good sweeps and his good jiu-jitsu, I think he could find dominant positions and find a decision similar to Tim Elliott. Ulabenkov just was getting out-scrambled, and Carpenter being a much younger, more explosive guy than Tim Elliott, I think he's going to be able to out-scramble him in a similar way. Next fight at the card, we got Benardo Sopaj versus Ricky Turcios. This fight was originally made in November, and it's finally happening. Let's see. Benardo Sopaj is mainly known for getting knocked out in one of the KOs of the year last year against Vinicius Oliveira. However, if you watch that whole fight, you'll see that Sopaj out-grappled Oliveira in the first round, out-grappled him for a lot of the second round, and mainly the fight was on short notice, and Sopaj kind of only lost because he gassed out and was pretty vulnerable towards the end. I don't remember what the scorecards were, but round 2 was pretty close. Round 1 was clearly Sopaj's, and round 3 was clearly Oliveira's. So if that fight went a couple more seconds, maybe Sopaj got the decision. But he did get knocked out with 10 seconds left by a flying knee. But again, that was almost a year ago. Lots of time off. Sopaj's had, the canceled fight against Turcios. So I think he's probably improved a good amount. He's going to be ready for this fight, unlike he was for the Oliveira fight. Like I said, this matchup was made originally for November, so he's had months to prepare against Turcios. And Ricky Turcios in his last fight against Rosa Jr., he was pretty easily out-grappled. He's 2-2 in the UFC. Both of his wins are by split decision, so not exactly what we want to see. In his first fight in the UFC, he fought Brady Highstand, who's a pretty solid grappler, and he was getting pretty easily out-grappled in the first round. But then Highstand gassed and ended up losing that fight by split decision. But I think with the time to repair, Sopaj will have more than 2 rounds of cardio, or more than a round and a half of cardio. And if he gets the back of Ricky Turcios like he did for Vinicius Oliveira, I think he can get the finish because of how easily Turcios got finished in the grappling by Rosa Jr. So I'm going with Sopaj by either an early submission or a closed late decision. I guess all decisions are late inherently, but next fight up the card, we've got Rinya Nakamura versus Muin Gafurov. I'm kind of sick of Rinya Nakamura getting these jobbers. He's getting very easy fights, especially for how hyped up he is. Undefeated guy, 9-0. He's a pretty solid grappler. He's got good power on the feet. It's kind of a classic trope in MMA where you got this really good wrestler with dynamite in his hands. But Nakamura a little disappointing in his UFC career. A couple wins by knockout, and then his past 2 or 3 have been kind of boring decisions where he just lays in praise. He gets good positions, but he doesn't really do much with them. Kind of similar to Jail Almeida, that kind of boring grappler. But yeah, he's definitely a good fighter. And Muin Gafurov, kind of a different story. 1-2 in the UFC. He's 19-6 in his career. Not a very clean record. His only win in the UFC is over Kyung Ho Kang, who is 19-11. So not a very clean win for him. And from what I've seen from him, he seems pretty defensively irresponsible in grappling. In his fight, second fight in the UFC against Said Nurmagomedov, he was getting not even hurt on the feet. He was just kind of getting outpointed on the feet. And about 40 seconds in, he shot a really bad takedown, got caught in a standing guillotine, and got finished in the first minute. So not what you want to see. I think I can see something similar happening where Gafurov gets kind of pressured against the fence, tries to cover up, and the strength of Nakamura and the power kind of, scares him into shooting a bad takedown or, ending up in a bad spot on the ground. And I think Nakamura can have his kind of coming out party, get a good finish in, the first or second round, and actually look pretty good. So I'm going to pick Nakamura to win. He's a pretty big favorite, but I think he'll exceed my expectations, which have been lowered by his past couple fights. Next fight of the card, we've got Ailin Perez versus Karol Rosa. This one's hard to pick because I think Ailin Perez has been a little overrated in her career. Not necessarily overrated. Like, I don't think people think she's some great fighter, but I do think she gets talked about a lot more than her skills maybe deserve, and I think you might know why. And then Karol Rosa, it's hard to say. She's one of those fighters who have losses to good fighters and wins over bad fighters, but mixed results on the in between. So you don't really know if they're on the bad side of the good fighters or the good side of the bad fighters. Which is kind of where I place Ailin Perez too. I think she's somewhere in the middle, just outside the rankings or in the higher rankings at bantamweight. Ailin Perez has a 4-fight win streak. I think she's undefeated in the UFC. That's not true, actually. She has a 4-fight win streak, though. I think she's got wins against pretty decent, or pretty underrated, at least, competition. I think Dvalashvili is actually pretty solid. Her only other loss is to Melissa Tanya Mullins, who is, I think, pretty underrated. I think she's underrated because she has that loss to Nurmagomedov, which was kind of fluky, but regardless, yeah, Dvalashvili, not bad, and Ailin Perez finished her. And then Jocelyn Edwards, I think, is also pretty solid, pretty decent win, especially for where she was in the UFC at the time. Ailin Perez, one of her 2 losses is a disqualification, and that was pre-UFC. That was against Tamir Vidal, who was in the UFC. I think she just signed to the GFL, but she was a UFC level fighter. So you can argue that if you take away that performance, she's 11-1, pretty solid record against 18-6. Karol Rosa has a loss to Melissa Gatto. She got finished by Melissa Gatto, which is a bad look. Melissa Gatto has proven to not be a very good fighter. She has lost to Sarah McMahon, which is pretty recent too, and not a very good loss. And then she has losses to Nurmagomedov and Irene Aldana, who are both, top of bantamweight. Not great, not bad. Obviously you would prefer a win, but 2 losses to them, it doesn't mean she's terrible. She has a split decision to Tana Santos, who's 14-7. Not a good look. You want to get a pretty clear win over someone with a record like that. Yeah, I don't think Karol Rosa has that many good wins, and I think it's hard to take away from Ailin Perez's resume. So I'm just going to pick Ailin Perez, especially as an underdog. She's plus 200. I don't really see why. We know when Rosa's best wins are Jocelyn Edwards, who Ailin Perez also beat, 2021 Bekoev and Pandy Kianzad, who all by decision and all not very good fighters. It's hard to pick her, especially as a big favorite, especially against an up-and-coming fighter who the UFC is kind of behind, no pun intended, right now. So I'm going to pick Ailin Perez to win this, probably by decision because it's WMA. Next fight at the card, we've got Grant Dawson versus Carlos Diego Ferreira. Very interesting fight. Obviously, Grant Dawson, 10-1 in the UFC, pretty exciting prospect. 10-1-1 rather, he has a draw. And Carlos Diego Ferreira, interesting fighter. He's fought pretty much the cream of the crop in the UFC so far. His last 7 fights have only been against guys who have gone up to be a top 5, top 4. Gamrot and Dariush and people like that. And then even earlier in his career, he fought Dustin Poirier and Michael Johnson, guys at the top featherweight. So, a perennial top contender. Never been really ranked that highly. I don't think he's been ranked higher than 13 or 14. But always, fighting the top of the top, fighting good prospects. In his last fight, he fought Mateusz Rebecki, or Rombesky, however you say his name. And he was getting whooped in the beginning, and then Rebecki kind of gassed. It's hard to tell if he got gassed or not, or if he just kind of took too much damage. And he ended up, coming back and winning the fight in the second and third round. So yeah, my take is that Carlos Diego Ferreira gets most of his wins and his good performances against opponents that struggle to kind of take the fight where they want to take it. If their grapplers keep it grappling, if their strikers keep it striking, and also opponents that make mistakes as the fight goes on. If you think of Rebecki, He doesn't have a lot of good head movement, so he just kind of compounded damage as the fight went on. He didn't eat any clean strikes in the first and second round, but he just got hurt and hurt and hurt, and that slowed him down. And he ended up, taking a ton of damage later in the fight. Grant Dawson really hasn't struggled to take the fight where he wanted to take it. The only times he struggled are against Tom Nolan, who's a really good scrambler, really good on the bottom. And obviously Dawson's, wrestler, so he wants to stay on top. So Dawson was able to, out scramble him in 2 of the rounds. And then obviously Bobby Green knocked out Grant Dawson in 40 seconds with a jab. So I think Grant Dawson will probably be able to take the fight to the grappling and out control Ferreira. My concern is he chinny? Because Ferreira did, he does have a lot of knockouts on his record. He was able to finish a guy like Mateusz Rebecki, who, I kind of rate better as a, striker than Grant Dawson. But I don't know. I don't really see chinning him. I think it definitely could happen, and that's my biggest concern is just like landing a good punch and knocking out Dawson, kind of like he was able to do against Michael Johnson. But I think the most likely result is Grant Dawson to take the fight to the grappling, stay on top, out control him, out damage him. Grant Dawson I feel like he's improved a lot in his last couple. In his fight after his fight against Bobby Green, can't remember who he was against. I think Joe Selecki. He took it to kind of a boring decision, and he got a lot of boos in the crowd. I think that was at 297. And it just wasn't like, it was a little disappointing. It wasn't really, like being touted as the next Khabib, and he's taking a guy to a boring decision, not like doing a ton of damage. And then against his last opponent, I think it was Rafa Garcia or Steve Garcia, Grant Dawson did a ton of damage, got the finish in the second round, looked a lot better. And I think we'll see more of that Grant Dawson than the Grant Dawson we saw before, which shows that, he's improving a lot. Should also mention that Diego Ferreira is 40 years old and Grant Dawson's only 30. I say only 30. It's not exactly like he's, the youngest prospect, but 10 years younger than his opponent. I think he's improving. He's on the way up. He's either at his prime or he's getting there. So, and then Ferreira is probably, a good 5-10 years past his prime. So I'm going Grant Dawson. This is one of the fights, especially early on the card, that I'm looking most forward to. So yeah, go one to look out for sure. Next fight of the card, Bogdan Guskov versus Billy Elekana. Don't got to put a ton of thought into this one. Bogdan Guskov originally scheduled to fight Johnny Walker. Johnny Walker had to pull out because of an injury. So Guskov gets 7-1 Billy Elekana. Elekana's not very good. He's LFA fighter, UFC debut. I'm surprised like Ponoele Soriano didn't come into this fight, or I guess he's a light heavyweight. No, he should have filled in for the Zacharias fight I'm going to talk about later. But I'm surprised there wasn't someone from last week's card to fill in. But yeah, Billy Elekana lost to a 4-0 Daniel Compton, who is now 8-4. So he's 3-4 since their last fight. He also went to a split decision with Chuck Campbell, who was 5-2 at the time. Chuck Campbell's best win is Jared Vandera in 2023. Not a good look. Just Billy Elekana hasn't fought anyone UFC level. Bogdan Guskov has actually looked pretty good. He's had 3 fights in UFC, all of them against pretty solid opponents in Ryan Spann, Zach Pauga, and Volkan Oezdemir. Obviously, he came short against the best opponent of the 3, Oezdemir, but looked really good against Spann. Looks like he had a really good chin, so I don't think he's going to get fluke knocked out. Which is interesting because when I was doing research about Guskov for that Spann fight, I was like, man, he looks really chinny early in his career. But I think he's kind of improved that. And then, the fighters that he fought that have proven, are fighters that he's fought that are proven, in guys like Spann, in Pauga, he hasn't struggled against them. Obviously, he lost to Oezdemir, but Oezdemir is on a whole different level from those guys, I think, and he's definitely on a whole different level from Billy Elekana. So I'm going to go with Guskov, probably to get a finish early in the fight. Next fight at the card, we've got another fight that got a late replacement. It's supposed to be Cedric Dumas versus Zach Reese, but Cedric Dumas, I think he had an injury and dropped out, and Azamat Bekoev filled in about a week ago, or I think on Tuesday, so not even a full week. This one was hard to pick because I think Bekoev is probably the better fighter. Zach Reese was undefeated coming to the UFC. He was a Contender Series guy. His only loss on his record, he's 8-1, was against Cody Runnage, and that was arguably a little fluky. It was a slam KO, and you don't always see the best fighters or the better fighter win in like a slam KO. But um, you know, since then he had a good win after that in his comeback fight, and then his last fight was against Jose Medina, and in my opinion, he had a pretty disappointing performance. Wasn't able to look like super impressive. Wasn't able to get a finish, and Jose Medina is not exactly the best fighter. Um, Also, Zach Reese, undefeated coming to the UFC. If you look at his record, um, before the UFC, he fought a lot of like total bums. Like a lot of the guys he fought, were like 1-0. I think one guy was 1-0, lost to him, and then retired. One guy was 0-1, ended his career 0-3. His last fight before the Contender Series was against a 5-10 opponent. Just not the best record, and I think Bekoev is probably just the better fighter. Bekoev is 4-0 in the LFA. He's 6-3 in ACA and ABA. So, and he's pretty young. He's only 29, and he's been fighting for 10 years. He's got, let's see, 12 more fights than Zach Reese. He's probably just the more experienced guy, probably the better fighter all around. And I'm going to take him to win. The one thing that's, making this hard is that Bekoev stepped in on, 6 days notice, 5 days notice. So not exactly the best circumstances, but he made weight. He looked in shape. So I think he's probably going to get this one done on Saturday. All right. Last fight, the prelims, we've got one I think a lot of people are excited for, Payton Talbott versus Raoni Barcelos. This fight would have been more exciting if you could take Raoni Barcelos back about 6 or 7 years. But Barcelos is very, very much a good fighter. He's always game. He's been historically game against good prospects. He had close fights against Timur Valiev and Victor Henry when they were on the come up. And he beat Said Nurmagomedov and Chris Gutierrez, both those guys, when they're on the come up, when they're unproven. So obviously, he's got the potential to beat, similar fighters like Talbott. But I just think that Talbott is, one, a really good matchup for Barcelos, and two, Barcelos is kind of, like I said, 6 or 7 years removed from his prime. And recently he's kind of lost more than he's won. He didn't have like the most impressive performance. He opened as like a close, like a slight favorite against Landon Quinones, who is not good. And then Talbot is kind of just, all momentum in the world, looking unstoppable. Didn't have the best performance against Nick Aguirre, but looked amazing against Cameron Simon, who I think is his best opponent so far. He looked, he knocked out Giannis Gamori in, 20 seconds. So kind of hard to outdo that. If Barcelos wants to get to the fight to the ground, which is where Talbot has struggled historically, I think he's going to struggle to do so. And that's because Barcelos has kind of always been susceptible to strike the middle. If you look at his fight against Umar, a guy with really good game plans, threw about 100 knees in that fight. And he ended up knocking him out, just missing a knee and throwing a hook behind it, because Barcelos likes to duck his head down. And Simon, a guy who does pretty similar stuff with ducking his head down and ducking in for takedowns, tried to do the same thing against Talbot, and Talbot kept catching the knees up the middle every time he ducked down. So I think if Barcelos tries to duck into the clinch or a takedown, or tries to just dodge strikes up the middle, he's going to find a knee there. And regardless, I just think Talbot has a lot of pop, a lot of good hard punches. He's technical, good leg kicks. He's the kind of guy that, unless you're a really good grappler, you're not going to be able to easily fraud check him or just fluke knock out him. So I think Talbot, pretty big favorite for a good reason. I think he'll take this one. On to the main card. We've got the main card opener, Reinier de Ridder versus Kevin Holland. Now this one, another one's hard to pick because obviously, Reinier de Ridder, not the most technical guy. A lot of people are saying he's like the skinny DDP, the jiu-jitsu DDP. Like, he looks very sloppy, especially on the feet. He looked pretty, like I said, sloppy against what's his name, Joe Mirchart. And he comes from one, and one is not exactly the most proven promotion. Like, fighters coming into the UFC from one don't always look the best. But his only losses in his career have been to Anatoly Malikin, who, since then has lost to, Umar Kane. So maybe not the best losses, but Reinier de Ridder, obviously a pretty solid guy, pretty solid fighter. Maybe he's a good guy, maybe he's not, I don't know. But pretty solid fighter. And I think the main reason I'm going to pick him, and the main reason why, is because of the stylistic matchup, and what Kevin Holland has been able to do recently in his career. And I think what he hasn't been able to do is outstrike opponents who are at, natural middleweights. He got dropped by Mikhail Oleksiejczuk. MVP was a pretty big welterweight. You know, I got pretty clearly outstruck him. Vettori beat him. Brunson beat him, and Darren Stewart, who is, like a Bellator Cage Warriors guy, took him to a split decision. So guys that are pretty big natural middleweights have had success against Kevin Holland, especially recently in his career. Like I said, that Oleksiejczuk fight, the MVP fight, and the Vettori fight have been all of his most recent fights at middleweight. I guess MVP was at welterweight, but that was MVP is a pretty big welterweight. So guy like Reynard Ritter, who's pretty tall for middleweight, I think he's going to be. I think Kevin Holland's going to find it hard to like land solid strikes on him, and I don't think he's going to be able to finish him on the feet. And I do think that Reynard Ritter will be able to out-grapple him both to a decision or with a submission. He looked really, really good against Meerschaert in the grappling. Not exactly on the feet, but I just think like Reynard Ritter is a different level grappler from a lot of the guys we've seen in the UFC so far. And some of the stuff he was doing against a guy like GM3, who's a very good grappler, was just like if he does it to Kevin Holland, he's going to get the finish even earlier. So Kevin Holland's also coming off a rib injury to Roman Dolidze from the Roman Dolidze fight just 3 months ago. So I doubt he's had the best training camp. I doubt he's improved a ton since his last fight. And Roman Dolidze is very similar to Reynard Ritter in that he's a grappler first, and he doesn't have the cleanest, most technical striking. Doesn't have a good jab. He's going to pump out there. But if he gets the fight to the ground, which he can do from the clinch, which he can do by just being bigger or maybe landing a good punch and having a good spot. And he was able to out-grapple Kevin Holland. That obviously the fight was an injury, so it's not like he forced an injury, broke his rib. But I think that the success that Dolidze had, if Reynard Ritter can have the same success, he can get a finish or carry that success on throughout the rest of the fight and get a decision win. So I'm going to pick Ritter to win. Again, I think Kevin Holland might be the better overall fighter. He's had success, in close fights against guys like Jack Della Maddalena, and he looked, it made MVP look a little boring and made him look out of his element. So obviously Kevin Holland is a pretty solid fighter, but I just think he's a bad matchup for Reynard Ritter, especially coming off of a rib injury just a couple months ago and not having the most momentum right now. Also, Kevin Holland tends to not care the most about the result of his fight. So, obviously that's not what you want to look for in a winning fighter. So, next fight on the card, Jailton Almeida versus Sergey Spivak. This one to me is pretty easy to pick. I think Jailton Almeida is probably the best grappler at light heavyweight right now, at least at the top of the rankings. I'm sorry, not light heavyweight, heavyweight. And the reason why I believe that is because I have this theory that every single light heavyweight is better than every single heavyweight at grappling outside the top 5. And the reason why I say that is because just look at it historically. John Jones was so easily able to grapple Cyril Gane, and Jailton Almeida has so easily been able to out-grapple everyone he's fought. Both Almeida and Spivak have kind of made a heavyweight career out of out-grappling blobs and being able to grapple like low-level guys who can't get off their back or don't know how to get out of submissions or are very unathletic and aren't explosive. But I think that Almeida has just done it to such a higher level. Obviously, Spivak is coming off against that win against Tybura, but I think that was a little fluky. And he was very easily taken down. Tybura just first takedown he shot, single leg, was able to sweep out the leg and get on top. And I totally think that Almeida would be able to do that too. I also think that if Almeida gets on top of Spivak, it's kind of over Spivak. He's not the most athletic guy. He's not the most explosive guy. And Almeida easily out-grappled Curtis Blades, who I think is a much better grappler than Sergey Spivak. I think Sergey Spivak is a similar level fighter to Alexander Romanov. I don't know why I'm struggling to get these words out. Similar level grappler to Alexander Romanov. Both of them are, I think they're both Moldovan. So similar fighters, and Almeida, submitted Romanov in the first round. He was just, obviously Romanov kind of knew what he was doing on the ground, but Almeida was just too quick, too good at scrambling, ended up in better positions in every scramble, and found the neck and got the submission. So I think that if Almeida is able to keep up that grappling that he has shown in his last 2 fights, and his last 4 fights, honestly, I think he'll find that success. So and probably get a finish pretty early on. I think Spivak isn't the most technically looking guy, or technical looking guy. I think he'll probably give up his neck or give up an arm and bar or something like that. So I'm going Almeida, first round submission. Next fight of the card, we got the featured fight, Yuri Prohaska versus Jamal Hill. Very, very interesting fight. Both of them, when you look at the totality of their careers, especially in the UFC, they have a lot of success, former champions. Both of them won their belt off Glover Teixeira. Decent amount of similarities, but the most glaring similarity is that both of them are undefeated in the UFC other than Alex Pereira, except Jamal Hill has that, lost to Paul Craig, which you can argue is a little fluky. Paul Craig has shown he's not like a higher level fighter than Jamal Hill. He's had less success career. So if you want to say that's fluky, both of them have only had their only legitimate losses to Alex Pereira in the UFC, and in their entire careers. Jamal Hill's only losses are to Pereira and Paul Craig in his whole career, and Yuri's only losses are to Alex Pereira in the last decade. So interesting fight. When I look at the resumes, I broke this fight down into two portions: the resume and the matchup. Quickly with the resume, Yuri is undefeated against Southpaws, and he's got a lot more fights than Hill. He's got 35 fights, Hill has 14, so he's got 21 more fights. It's almost triple his amount of fights. I think Yuri's also faced much better competition throughout his career, especially in the UFC. He's fought Dominic Reyes, Volkan Oezdemir, Glover Teixeira, and then Prohaska twice, and Rakic. And then Hill's fought guys like Ovince St. Preux and Jimmy Crute, just like not exactly top level guys. And then also Johnny Walker and Glover Teixeira. So the interesting thing to look at is the Pereira fight. If you want to compare it just like straight up, in their most recent Pereira fight, you could say, well, Hill, he did get knocked out faster, but he had more success on the feet. He looked better with the outside, foot battle, and the step-up low kicks. But when you look at the actual matchup, I'll break down real quick. So I think Hill is unlikely to beat Yuri in a decision without getting caught on the feet. Now, I do think that Hill could catch him because we've seen Yuri's chin, kind of like that last Pereira fight couldn't have been good for Yuri's chin, but he's had a pretty good chin historically. If it is cracked, I think Hill obviously has a chance to catch him, like he caught Walker, like he caught Crute, like he ended up catching St. Preux. But I do think that in Hill's last three fights, like he hasn't gotten finished within the first 3 rounds, and this is a 3-round fight, which I think helps Yuri. I think he's unlikely to find beat Yuri in a decision without getting caught out of position, because that's what Yuri does. He's really good at catching people out of position. And I think the reason why he struggled against Pereira is because Pereira is pretty much never out of position to throw. Anytime Yuri, even then he did find success against Pereira. That's when he did, when he was backing up, when he was focusing on blocking rather than slipping punches, getting out of the way. I don't think Hill is going to be able to go all the way through a 15-minute fight without getting caught out of position, because if you look at his footwork, he's almost always out of position. I also think that a very important thing to note about this fight, and I think what is going to make Yuri win the most, is the fact that Hill doesn't have good footwork, and he's not going to be able to keep himself off the cage. And also, the cage is where Yuri does his best work, in my opinion. I listed every fighter that Yuri has had success against the cages. Well, not every fighter, because I didn't watch all his fights, but all of the fights that I watched, he had good success against cage. You look at the Glover fight. He hurt Glover against the cage with a flying knee and with a good right hand. When he got Pereira bad, it was when he was backing up against the cage. He finished both Reyes and Oezdemir. Both of his finishes in the UFC by knockout were against the cage. In one of his first fights against Martin Schultz, he finished him against the cage. He finished Darko Stojic against the cage. He finished Satoshi Ishii against the ropes in a risen, which is their equivalent to a cage. He finished Kazuyuki Fujita against the ropes. He finished Carl Albrechtsen against the ropes. I don't know how to say his name. He finished Jake Yoon against the ropes. He finished King Mo against the ropes. A lot of his best performances, a lot of his best knockouts, and his against best opponents are against the cage. And you look at all of Hill's fights, where does he end up? Where does he default? Look at where he got caught against Pereira, against the cage. Look at the OSP fight. Look at how much of the OSP fight Jamal Hill spent backing up, throwing punches while against the cage, out of position. If he does it against Yuri, he's going to get caught. and he's going to get finished. So I'm taking Yuri to find him. One interesting thing I could see is a flying knee. A lot of people, when Yuri starts to kind of overwhelm them from strikes they don't see, they tend to try to move their head around. And I don't think Jamal Hill has the most, he's not the type of guy to rely on head movement the most. But, we have seen that before, where fighters get overwhelmed by Yuri and they try to move their head, and he throws a flying knee and he catches them. And I totally think he could do that. I think that's what my prediction is going to be. I think that Jamal Hill is going to back up against the cage because he's trying to land those step-up low kicks, which require you to get the perfect distance. So, he's not going to be able to push Yuri back and get that perfect distance. He's going to have to back up and find himself. He's going to back up too much, find himself against the cage, and get caught with the right hand, or maybe get caught with a couple hooks, and then duck into a flying knee. So, I think Yuri's going to win. I just think you can't really fight like Jamal Hill does and not get caught over 3 rounds. So yeah. Next fight of the card, co-main event, Merab Dvalashvili versus Umar Nurmagomedov. This is the last fight I really put research into because of what's happening in the main event, but we'll go through this one quick. Or maybe not. I'll probably take my time. Okay, so I'm going to pick Umar to win. I got to start off with that. I think Umar is a much better striker than Merab, and he's also proven to have the ability to finish fighters on the feet, which Merab hasn't been able to do since he's been in the UFC. Obviously, he got signed to the UFC with that spinning back fist win against Rafian Stotts, but since then, Merab hasn't had success on the feet, and therefore, I think he's going to try to take the fight to the round, or at least into the grappling. The reason why Jose Aldo and Peter Yan struggled against Merab is that they allowed themselves to get backed up against the cage, and Merab was able to hold them there. Now, even though Merab couldn't get the takedowns going in those fights, he was able to get them when he wanted them, and that wasn't on the ground, that wasn't with their back on the mat, that was against the cage. So, the reason why I don't think he's going to be able to do that against Umar is because, one, Umar, most of his fights take place in the center of the octagon. You watch that Sanhagen fight, it rarely went against a cage, and if it did, and if Umar ever ends up against cage, it's when he backs his opponent up against cage. So I don't think Merab will find himself, trying to dodge strikes and backed up all the way against cage, and I don't think he's going to allow Merab to just shoot and then get him stuck against cage. And even if he does, if you look at Islam Makhachev, and if you look at that Dagestan, breed of fighter, especially recently, whenever they get stuck against the cage, they use judo throws. And I think the reason why they do this, and the reason why they're so good at it, is because all of them were training partners of Khabib. And one thing Khabib likes to do is take you down against the cage and beat you up. And if you don't want to get beaten up, you got to find a solution. And I think Islam's solution with those overhook judo throws and those judo trips, I really think that that's the best way to do it. And if Merab gets, Umar against cage, he's going to use those judo throws. We haven't seen him use them a ton. He had some pretty interesting trips and throws against Sanhagen, but he hasn't really been, held against cage. But if he does, I think that he'll be able to use those throws. And those throws will obviously get him off the octagon, get off the cage, and they'll bring him closer to the center of the octagon. So even if Merab gets him where he wants him, where he was able to get Yan and Aldo, I think that Umar has the perfect counter to it. And then obviously in Merab's last fight, you might be thinking he didn't have to hold O'Malley against cage. And the reason why he didn't have to hold O'Malley against cage is because O'Malley was really, really good at keeping his back off the cage, which is what I personally would do. Unfortunately for O'Malley, he didn't need to be against the cage because Merab was able to shoot those same takedowns that Aldo and Yan were able to drag over the cage, and O'Malley didn't stuff them. He got taken down right away in the middle of the octagon, which is exactly where you don't want to be. Now, obviously against Merab, you don't want to be stuck against cage, but it's even worse to be stuck in half guard in the middle of the octagon with no cage to stand yourself up. So I don't think Merab will have success taking Umar down in the middle of the cage without using the fence. Especially because he was completely unable to do it against Aldo. Aldo stuffed all of his takedowns, and Yan stuffed more takedowns than anyone has stuffed in a UFC fight ever against Merab. So, and then obviously even if Merab is successful with the takedowns, we don't really know how great his grappling is as just a wrestler. He didn't have a ton of success doing damage against Cejudo and against O'Malley and Yan when he got him down. And I think obviously Umar is an amazing grappler. He's out of that Dagestan camp. He's in AK. He's grappling every day. So he's probably a pretty solid grappler. So yeah, I think he'll have more success than O'Malley if he ends up on his back. given his environment. So I'm going to take Umar. I think he's the perfect stylistic matchup. I think even we might see Umar shoot. So yeah. Main event: Islam Makhachev versus Moicano. I think a lot of us would rather have seen this be Arman Tsarukyan, but I do like Moicano. I think it'll be cool to see him in a championship fight environment, headlining a pay-per-view. Maybe he'll have a good speech, win or loss, but I don't think he's going to win. I think, like pretty much everyone else, I'm picking Islam. But I'm not going to end the video there. I'm going to give you one area where I think Moicano can succeed, and then I'll give my, I'll give my total fight prediction after that. Like I previously mentioned, Islam has had a ton of success grappling from the clinch with those overhook judo throws. He also has really good striking from the clinch, and because of that, I think that was probably a lot of his game plan against Arman. Obviously, Arman likes to scramble, and one way to prevent a guy from scrambling is to get him with a good trip or a good throw where you're going to end up in half guard or in his guard in a position where it's a lot harder to get your hips out and scramble. So I think that Islam's game plan for Arman was get to the clinch, land some knees, especially if you're having trouble on the feet, and then from there focus on trips and throws, especially with the overhook. And unlike Arman, I think Moicano also uses a lot of good techniques from the clinch. If you watch his fight against Jalen Turner, you watch his fight against Benoit Saint-Denis, he likes to take the back from the clinch, and he likes with the underhook, and he likes to do outside trips. So pretty good clinch fighter. And using those transitions, using those trips and those back takes, he was able to get straight into dominant positions from the clinch to the ground. He was able to get the back take against Jalen Turner and end up on his back on the ground. He was able to get him out against Benoit Saint-Denis and beat him up from mount, straight from the clinch. And because Islam might rely on those judo throws, which require an overhook, and therefore give Moicano an underhook, I think Islam might find himself giving up his back by giving Moicano the underhook and take him into a scramble or into a onto the ground. And I think that's kind of an interesting position because I could totally see Moicano getting someone's back from that. I don't know if he's going to. I think obviously Islam comes from a pretty good camp. They've probably game planned that tonight or last night. Obviously Arman is a pretty solid grappler, and they were probably worried about him taking their back or out scrambling Islam. So obviously I think that's not the most likely result. I don't think Moicano is just going to take his back and submit him or finish him with punches or whatever. But I do think that totally could happen. I think people very strongly underrate Moicano's wrestling. If you look at the RDA fight, I know he got beat up a lot on the feet, but if you look at some of the stuff he was doing in the grappling on a couple days notice, it was super impressive. Having no training camp, and especially using butterfly hooks and things like that to prevent RDA from getting good positions when he got the takedown, and then using reversals to prevent the takedowns. Super impressive for Moicano, and I think he'll be able to show off some of that against Islam. I just think Islam is a different level on the feet and probably the better grappler overall. So, when you ignore Moicano's strengths in the grappling or his strongest aspects, I think Islam's probably better pretty much everywhere else. And I don't think Moicano's will be able to throw up a triangle over an armbar from the bottom and get a submission. So he's going to have to do some creative work in scrambles and in the wrestling. If not, he's just going to be trying to survive. So yeah, my final prediction is I think Islam's going to win, but I do think Moicano is going to be able to survive for 5 rounds. I don't think he's going to get submitted super easily, and he doesn't take a ton of even when he takes a ton of damage on the feet, he doesn't lose it completely. Obviously in the Jalen Turner fight, he almost got knocked out, came back, and got the finish, got the win. And against RDA, he was able to survive in a 5-rounder on a couple days' notice after taking a ton of damage. So I think he'll be able to survive, but I don't think he'll be able to, get some crazy fluke win, or, obviously I don't think he's going to out-technique Islam and win a decision. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think of my predictions in the comments. Make sure to like the video, subscribe. And, if you want to check my other predictions from last week, I went 7 for 7. That is all. Enjoy the fight tomorrow.